So this is my very first long form video for YouTube, and we'll see how this goes. I'd like to talk about my life in Appalachia. I'm a city girl, but at the first part of my married life, my first marriage, I found myself in Appalachia. I didn't even know what Appalachia was, but I found out pretty quickly what it was. I will start by talking about how I ended up in Appalachia, and then from there, there'll be more stories about my life in Appalachia. And it was a good life. It was different. Um, it was different than the city life that I was used to. I was born and raised in Southwest Ohio, in the Cincinnati, Ohio area, and we moved around. We moved Mom and Dad, we moved 31 times when I was growing up. And then they continued to move after that quite a few times. My dogs are bothering me here, so I hope that you don't hear them interrupt me as I talk. I met my husband when I was living in Pleasant Ridge, which is around Norwood, Ohio area, that area. And I worked at a King Quick. It was a convenience store, and they sold gas, kind of like a Shell Food Mart, something like that. But this was back in the early 1980s. And he lived next door in an apartment building. And we met. And one night we decided that we were going to drive to see his parents. I won't get into how that all came about, but he slept most of the way. As I drove, I thought, oh, I can drive to Kentucky, no big deal, because we used to live in northern Kentucky, another city. We used to live in northern Kentucky, which was a city, and where we were going was anything but a city, but I didn't know that at the time. And it was very dark. We drove at night into the very early morning hours. You have to remember that at that time, there wasn't any GPS. There were no cell phones. I didn't have a map to go by. I just listened to him as I drove, him telling me which roads to take. And then eventually he fell asleep, and I found myself driving in Appalachia in the dark. And I'm kind of glad it was dark, because I didn't see the things that I saw once the sun came up. And once the sun came up, I saw old houses, kind of dilapidated, falling down kind of houses. I since learned that those were called the old home places of the people that lived in Appalachia a long time ago. And some of them had washing machines on the front porch. There were broken down cars in the yards that were rusting away. These old houses sometimes had right next to them an old trailer, and sometimes new trailers. It seemed to me that as the sun came up, I saw the grandeur of these mountains. These mountains were absolutely beautiful. Now, I'm not talking about like mountains with snow on them, not that type. They were huge hills, and these were the mountains of Kentucky. And as we got down further and further into Kentucky, the roads became more and more windy. And I found myself, as we went around each bend, not knowing what I would see, but I saw all this land, and I since learned that it was called bottomland because it was the bottom and the mountains were up here. So it was the bottomland. And I saw crops. I saw crops of corn, not like you would see in the Midwest where there were these huge farms growing corn, nothing like that. These were family farms where they had corn growing. And then there were farms with a strange plant that I didn't know anything about. I've found out later that this was tobacco. There were tobacco farmers there. In fact, my husband's family were backer farmers from way back in the day. the family grew tobacco, and they had a tobacco base, and they were allowed to grow tobacco, so much tobacco one year and not so much the next year. But anyhow, as we got down into the mountains, um, my husband, his name was Kelly, he'd say, now you go turn here, and we're going to go down this road, and this is the mouth of the holler. We don't go all the way up to the head of the holler. We're going to go in the mouth of the holler. And I'm like, this is all new vernacular to me. It was a new dialect, and it was tingling on my ears. It was really pretty. I just loved to hear it. And as I lived in Appalachia, I learned to speak that way as well. I just want to point out some of the words that I learned as I lived in Appalachia. Well, as my first visit, there were words that I did not know existed in the English language. And I love these words because I've since learned that these words came from where the hill people came from. They came from Scotland and Ireland, which is my heritage. And they were very clannish people, and they came to Appalachia to live because it reminded them of home. And some of the words that I've got a few notes here that I wrote down, but some of the words that I learned on my first visit, because I met my husband's family. I met his mommy and his daddy, and that was something new. I had never heard grown people calling their parents mommy and daddy. That was something new to me. But some of the other words were, as we turned onto this road and went down this long driveway, it's not called a driveway, it's called approach. And I learned later that the reason it's called approach is because it approaches the house. So as we went down the approach and we turned, there was a trailer that his mommy and daddy lived in, and there was this bottom land, and his mommy and daddy lived in this trailer, and his brother and his wife lived in this trailer, and just up from that there was the old home place where my mother-in-law and father-in-law had raised their children. And there's another story for that later. I just want to talk about some of the words that I heard and learned at the first visit to Appalachia. Approach, bottom. The bottom land was called the bottom because it was in the bottom. It wasn't up on the mountain. It wasn't up on the hill. I already talked about the mouth of the holler as opposed to the head of the holler. Now, the mouth of the holler, where we were, there was a creek, which was a tributary off the river. And at the head of the holler is where the holler started in the mountain. So the house that his mommy and daddy lived in, the trailer that his mommy and daddy lived in, were at the mouth of the holler. Another thing I learned, that there was a difference between milk. Every time they would talk about milk, they would talk about sweet milk, which was regular milk. So there was sweet milk and there's buttermilk. And to this day, I still call milk sweet milk. When I'm not talking about buttermilk, I call it sweet milk. And then there's a difference between light bread, which is store-bought bread. It's called light bread, as opposed to cornbread. The cornbread that you make in an iron skillet, with lard and meal. And there's all kinds of cooking videos I'm going to do. In fact, I'm going to do a cooking video, and I'm going to actually make the chicken and dumplings that I made when I lived in Appalachia. So thank you for staying this long in this video. This is my very first long form video, and I look forward to making the next videos about my life in Appalachia. There's one more thing I want to mention before I go. I was absolutely fascinated with the coal and wood burning stove in my mother and father-in-law's trailer. I learned a whole lot about kindling a fire in the coal and wood burning stove. In fact, I burned up every Tupperware lid that I had trying to kindle fires in those stoves. And I'll talk about that as well. I'll talk about our first house that we lived in Kentucky, and how we planted our big garden and how we tended to that, all kinds of things. So I look forward to talking with you all and describing my life in Appalachia when I lived there. And the next installment, I will be talking to you about when we actually moved to Appalachia and lived in the trailer with my husband's mom and dad for a few months. And I look forward to that. Thanks for sticking around, and I'll be talking at you later.